The Russo-Japanese War was fought between Japan and Russia from 1904 to 1905 for domination of Korea and Manchuria. At this time, Russia was seen as a powerful presence, trying to spread its influence across the whole world. One of the ways it did this was by establishing the Trans-Siberian Railway. This railway was the largest in the world, spreading all the way from Moscow to the city of Vladivostok, a port on the far eastern side of Russia that froze over seasonally. Port Arthur, open year-round on the Yellow Sea, was a Russian naval base located in the Liaodong Peninsula within Manchuria. How did the Russians manage to gain access to a port within this region? At the time, China was losing power and Russia took advantage of this situation. Russia put pressure on China to give them the port and they eventually succumbed to Russian demands. Before the war began, the Russians and Japanese were negotiating about what to do with the Korean peninsula. Even though Japan had just defeated China in the Sino-Japanese War, the Russians did not take Japanese suggestions seriously since Japan was not seen as a threat against the Russian Empire. The Japanese did not take lightly to this treatment, thus they began to plan a risky attack on the Russians that would inevitably start a full-scale war. What was life like for those that were stationed at Port Arthur? Many historical accounts of the city recall Port Arthur being like Chicago during its very early stages. The city was often considered rough, immoral, vulgar, and filthy. Unlike many other established port cities, Arthur was composed of soldiers, sailors, hired labor, and a plentiful supply of women to meet their needs. However, the port still offered a plethora of small music halls, gambling parlors, and Chinese theaters to provide the residents of Port Arthur with some means of entertainment. Regardless, Arthur can also be compared to that of the Wild West, where there was a very thin line between drinking and working. Since Japan and Russia were not at war, the attack on Port Arthur caught Russia off guard. The siege was launched on February 8, 1904, in the middle of the night. During the attack, Japanese torpedoes hit and heavily damaged the arsenal of ships that the Russians had gathered. Some of the Russian losses included ships that were named the Tsarevich, the Retvizan, and the Pallada. On February 9th, the Japanese continued to bombard the Russian fleet with shelling in an effort to defeat the Russians quickly. The next day, the Japanese officially declared all-out war on Russia. This surprise attack was just the first in a series of attacks by the Japanese against the Russians, and during World War II was compared to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Less than 1 week after the attack, there was another sea battle. On February 4, 1904, Admiral Togo of the Japanese Navy attempted to sink one of his own ships in order to blockade the entrance to Port Arthur. The plan failed since a damaged Retvizan was still grounded outside of the port. Even though this plan failed, Admiral Togo attempted the procedure 2 more times, but without success. On March 8, 1904, the Russians again attempted fighting against the Japanese fleet, but were still unsuccessful. Another battle of note took place just over a month later on April 10, 1904. On this day, the Japanese were able to lure 6 Russian destroyers out of the harbor where 6 mines were placed. These mines destroyed 2 Russian warships. On March 22nd of the same year, the Russians attacked the Japanese occupiers once again and managed to damage one of the Japanese ships. The Russians continuously attempted to break out of the port between the months of June and August, but they were never successful in their efforts. While the initial assault on Port Arthur by the Japanese shocked the Russian Navy, the brutal combat was now to come within the city itself. This victory and the port's close proximity to Manchuria allowed the Japanese to be able to move troops and equipment to and from Manchuria quickly and effectively. Now that the Russian fleet was bruised and battered, the Japanese were able to penetrate the port and land their own troops to put the city of Port Arthur under siege. The siege of Port Arthur saw the introduction of many new technologies used in subsequent wars of the 20th century. In fact, these highly sophisticated weapons included hand grenades, Maxim machine guns, electric fences, and shells that left craters over 5 miles wide. With all of this new technology, the siege of the port was more advanced than ever and would result in carnage on unthinkable scales. Before the Japanese attacked, the Russians had 50,000 men under the command of Major General Baron Stessel at Port Arthur. Stessel had strongly fortified Port Arthur. This foresight proved beneficial when the Japanese began their seizure of the city. With nearly double the troops, Japanese General Baron Marasuki attacked the Russians with an army 90,000 strong. Initially, the Japanese used shelling and infantry to attack the Russians. On August 7, 1904, the shelling began and carried on intermittently until August 19th of the same year. The Japanese started at the Orphan Hills, which would be later called the Battle of the Orphan Hills, where after the shelling they began a massive infantry assault on the Russians. Because of their preparations, the Russians put up a huge resistance to the Japanese attempt to take the hills. In fact, it was only after the Japanese suffered more than 1,000 casualties that they were able to capture the hills. Following the Battle of Orphan Hills, the Russian army gathered themselves and attempted to take a stand at the next set of hills. On August 13, 1904, the Battle of 174-meter Hill is where the Russians attempted to make another stand against the Japanese. Though they fought valiantly, the overall confusion of Russian leadership led them to be ineffective in their attempts to counter the attacks of the Japanese. Therefore, the Japanese were able to take 174-meter Hill on August 24th, with the Russians hanging on to the land further in. Japan was less successful in taking the city of Port Arthur via direct assault and began looking for a different strategy to try and conquer the city. Under the command of General Noji, the Japanese trenched themselves into the city and waited for their secret weapon, the siege howitzer. This huge shelling gun would be the demise of the Russians. With this artillery, General Noji was able to use a series of shelling and infantry charges to drive the Russians out of the city. Japan successfully continued this strategy and conquered the last Russian stronghold at 203-meter Hill on December 5, 1904. With the Russian army defeated, the Japanese used the same massive siege howitzer guns to bombard the Russian Navy over the course of 2 weeks, destroying virtually all of their ships. Defeated and in disarray, the Russians raised the white flag and surrendered. However, it was not until January 5th of 1905 that the Japanese would accept the Russians' proposal for surrender. Many Japanese men were involved in the fighting of this war, so what did the leaders in Japan do to make the people more patriotic? The biggest tool at their disposal was art. As we can see in this painting, the Japanese are portrayed as strong and courageous out at sea and extremely calculating as they fire their artillery at their Russian foes. One of the things this painting establishes is the political climate, since these Japanese artists were trying to build propaganda in support of their troops among the public. This painting presented here is just one of many paintings that were used to increase the public support for the war while Japanese troops were off to war against the Russians. The defeats of the Russian army shattered the pre-war confidence that the Russians had established for themselves before the war had begun. In 1905, the people of Russia revolted all across the country against the continued escalation of this war. The Russian Empire was more than capable of sending reinforcements to their current troops, but the defeats they experienced and the struggling economy made the war seem pointless in the eyes of the people. Thus, Russian Tsar Nicholas II negotiated a peace contract so that he could focus on fixing the internal damage within his nation. The mediator to the negotiations was Theodore Roosevelt, who was mutually chosen by both nations, leading to the signing of the Treaty of Portsmouth on September 5, 1905, at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in Maine. Once the treaty was signed, Russia officially recognized that Korea was under Japanese influence. It was also agreed that Russians were to evacuate Manchuria immediately. Soon after this declaration, Japan annexed Korea with little protest from the other world powers at this time. The treaty also cost Russia their rights to use Port Arthur and the southern half of Sakhalin Island to Japan. However, these assets weren't lost for an extended period of time, since the Russians were able to reclaim these two areas following Japan's defeat at the end of World War II. What was the significance of this war then, and how are the effects of this war still being felt today? In the early 20th century, this war was extremely significant due to the fact that the underdog had won the war. Japan was the first ever Asian country in modern times to be able to defeat a European power in war. This resulted in increased prestige for Japan, and it was then seen as a modern nation from that time forward. The result of this war was also a beacon of hope to countries that were colonized by various European powers. Many of these countries desired freedom from colonial rule. The Japanese victory brought hope to these countries, since Japan, an underdog, was unexpectedly able to defeat the more powerful nation. The victory over Russia allowed Japan to expand its influence in the region. Without the Russian presence, Japan was able to plan an attempt to take over China and the rest of Asia, which is what led them to their involvement in World War II. Japan's war efforts in World War II can still be felt today across the world in places such as the United States and China.